Hi gang, this is going to be a quick screencast that will really hopefully reduce the complexity of functions and why we use them. So all I'm going to go over is the syntax and how to pass arguments and what happens with those arguments. So remember, this class does just a couple of weeks of PHP, and then you're going to be using the same PHP throughout the course. So you're going to see this stuff again and again and again. So you don't need to panic if you're a person who looks at the amazing mountain of information that's being delivered at you. You don't have to panic because there's going to be a lot of repetition here. Remember, the point of 153, this course, is to get a deep dive into databasing. WebD 166 is going to give you the deeper dive into PHP, and that's where we'll get into file handling and some other groovy things that PHP offers us. But for now, what I'm going to do is just make a function. So a function is nothing more than a block of code that will run at a given time. So you have to call that block of code. Okay, so I'm going to call this sum block. And all I'm going to do is put curly braces after the function. So if I have this function right here, and inside this function I do something silly like echo hi class. Well, that function does one thing. And to call that function, I can simply write sum block. So remember from week 1 and 2, PHP loads top to bottom. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go right into my localhost, and I'm going to do functions.php. So we'll keep it really simple. This function is called, and it just says echo hi class. Well, that's neat. First thing I would want to do if I were you is check out, look at the warnings here. I didn't have a semicolon. So let's turn on error reporting. And let's do all to make sure we get a nice glimpse of everything that's going on. And then we're going to hit the browser again and do hi class. And look, we're still in good shape. That's because it's the last statement in the PHP file. Okay, so let's mess around a little bit. What happens if I misspell block and make it small case? Well, look at that. Nothing yet, right? So I'm going to go ahead and hit and comment that out, and we're going to hit this, and we get nothing. So what does that tell you about function names? That's sort of shocking that it would work like that. But again, we know PHP is a little bit of an interesting language. We've already seen in week 1 that we could add strings as long as they contain numbers. So let's try this. What happens if we do this? And I get an immediately fatal error. I don't even get a warning. So the way this works as far as error handling is it's good practice to do the same thing all the time. You can run this block of code, and remember, PHP is only on the server side. It doesn't understand user-driven events that might be on the browser. That would be JavaScript's function. Okay, so what we do is we port values into variables, and then we might be able to pass them to a function. So let's create a variable, and this can be called who. And I'll just send my information to who, and I'm going to say from space dot scalar who, scalar who, okay? And now when I go ahead and hit refresh, I can hit functions, and I say hi class from Chris. Okay, well this brings up all sorts of interesting things. We've kept our code pretty simple here. And now we can start thinking about, well, what if hypothetically we simply did remove the argument? What would happen? Would we get an error? Because we're sending data. And I can make an empty set like that. And I don't get an error, but I don't get a value either. So, okay, what if we have a variable that's expected called who, and we send nothing? Well, then I get an error. So basically, if you're expecting a value and you don't send it, you get an error. But if you send a value and you don't expect it, then you don't get an error. So this is interesting. Now I can go back and get my code working again from Chris. And in PHP, you can have unlimited amounts of arguments. Now each one of these things that you see in the parentheses is an argument. So now I can go something like this. Teacher, from Chris, your dot scalar teacher. Okay? And now I can do something like scalar teacher. Okay? So I'm passing two arguments now, and really as long as they're comma separated, you can send as many as you want. So I do this and I say, hi class, from Chris, who is the variable who, and teacher, who is that. So I sent a couple of values. Okay? So let's say I say something like teacher equals Scott Simpson. And you don't pass anything. Like let's say I do this. I can actually assign the variable up in the argument, like so. So I can say something like this and say, hi class, from Chris, you're Scott Simpson. And I passed the teacher to the wrong thing, but let's say I wanted to do janitor. It'll be nice, and we'll do teacher equals, at this point I should make the variable something smart, like position. And this can be something like position equals custodian. Okay, and so this is what we're testing. Custodian should be equal to position if it's not filled by what was sent in the argument. So I do this, and I get an empty because I don't have the variable position here. Okay, so what I'm doing now is from Chris, your janitor, and then I can remove that value and hit that. So custodian is the value unless I go principal. So the idea is you can keep playing with this, and we're calling this block of code in line 6, and I'm your principal. But you can also experiment with where PHP would create an error, and that's how you can learn. Honestly, that's sort of how I learned. I would take code, break it, and fix it. So in number 6, you see a comma, so PHP is expecting a second parameter, but it's not there. If I add a position, head honcho, I can go ahead and hit refresh, and it has that value. If I want who equals Chris, notice it's just a variable assignment, and I can have Tom here. So when I hit refresh, I have congratulations from Tom, your head honcho. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, in this class, imagine the values of Tom and head honcho are dynamic and coming from a database. That means whatever we do to some block, let's say we're formatting it for a paragraph like a blog post, that comes from a database. Well, I could call the function that formats that value straight from this and pass the value with a default in case something happened in the database. So to summarize, all functions are just simply blocks of code that run at a given time. And we can call those blocks of code right from the script itself. All right, we'll get into functions a little more deeply as we move on in the course.